Jesus incarnation.
It forces the mind to be creative.
Just on a different path.
We completely disregard everything they've ever said or done as a result of that.
Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of Oz Table Talk. My name's Luke. I'm at the table with Dave, Ben, and special guest,
Hi.
Dr. Dan. How you doing?
Well, thank you. How are you?
That's good. For people, I mean, you've been on the show before, so it was a while ago.
Okay. When we talk about COVID?
Yeah.
Okay.
We were talking about the loneliness during COVID and sort of coping through that when all the lockdowns were happening here in Bundy. So
that was fun.
It was fun.
But it wasn't here in this studio. It's pretty cool.
No, the studio is new. So, welcome to the new studio.
Oh, thank you. Fun trivia. I recorded that episode with you from the comfort of my car.
Oh, really? Well, cars are a really good place to record audio, so that kind of makes sense.
Yeah,
So.
good acoustics.
Yeah. So in addition to being a feature on the show before, tell us a little bit about you. So what do you do? What does your life look like?
My life looks like I am a husband, I'm a father, I'm a child of God. I like running.
Mm-hmm. That's an understatement, by the way. Like, how much do you like running?
A little bit, a lot, maybe. I don't know. Marathons.
I was going to say, how far? What's the maximum distance that you've ever run?
Close to 90K. But the race was 110 and I didn't finish. So that's a bit of a disappointment. I've done that a few times.
Okay.
So I do like a little bit of running. I also do podcasting in my spare time. Mm-hmm. But in my real spare time, I also work as a psychologist.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. That's what I tend
And so
to
give your podcast a plug. Or podcasts.
We've been on a bit of a pause, so I don't know if people want to go and check. But yeah, there is still enough material for them to go and check. We have a few, but probably the one that will be relevant to what we talk today will be Gluten Time.
Yep.
Gluten Time podcast.
Mm-hmm.
Gluten Time.
Gluten Time.
How did you come up with that name?
Adventisms. I think colloquialisms is Adventisms. I like gluten steaks. Most people have an aversion to gluten these days because of a lot of reasons, health reasons, physical. So I don't know. We wanted the podcast to be called Tofu Time, but there was already somebody who have hijacked the Tofu Time name on YouTube. And even though we were not doing YouTube, we thought like, maybe we need to foresee the future. If we were to go to YouTube, which we are thinking of, we had to change.
That's exciting.
We had to change to Gluten Time. Yeah.
Cool. That's cool. So and not to neglect you guys, how are you?
Yeah, good. Happy to be here. It's been a long time coming. How long have we been planning this series? Like a year?
Yeah, probably. We keep saying we have to do this.
Yeah, I think it has been
at least a year.
At least around that time.
I was going to say, I think it might even be longer than that.
Yeah.
Oh, really?
Yeah, maybe. Well, I was still living at my last place, and I've been here for over a year now. So,
were you?
Yeah.
Like that? Okay.
Yeah, so long time coming.
Yeah.
Super stoked to have Dan on. Love his work. Love his
thanks.
friendship.
Yeah.
So it's good to have you here.
Thank you. Thank you, Dave.
So, and you probably already know because you clicked on the episode. But today we're starting a new series where we're going to be looking at the mental health of characters in scripture, and we're looking at their personalities and just sort of seeing what we can learn from that, and looking at it also through your lens as a professional in the space. And so we're going to be talking firstly about David. So King David, not this David.
Please, not me.
That's disappointing. That's okay. We can do that.
You can save that for off air.
We might do a special episode.
Yeah, I don't want to be here for that one.
That's the whole process. Vulnerability brings growth.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, you can.
I'll let you know when I'm ready to grow.
Okay, that's fine.
Awesome. Well, for us to get underway, we thought it would be helpful for us to start with David's story. So let's start there. Let's talk a bit about his experience and walk through that.
So I guess first of all, why would we be considering David with psychologists at the table?
Good question.
I mean, I feel like that's pretty obvious. If you read any of the Psalms, he was quite emotive, wasn't he? In the Psalms, he sort of freely expressed himself through that avenue of sort of poetry and music.
Yeah, for sure.
And it gives us a real look into like his real thoughts and feelings. And I really like that about the character David, like that he was quite genuine, authentic, and
Yeah.
you can sort of feel like you can get in his heart a little bit.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
For sure. I think you're right. I think the idea of being able to resonate with the human parts of characters in the Bible brings the Bible alive. I think I was mentioning to you guys as we were preparing for this stuff that I had this problem of sometimes reading things or seeing things and not seeing it through the lens of what I've been doing for a while. And when I think of David, I think about him being super... him having a lot of characteristics of things of people that I see as my patients sometimes. But I think if we were to start thinking about him as somebody who can resonate with us, we have to go back to those aspects of his humanity.
Right.
So the questions here are, what do we know about David from the beginning? What do you guys think? Well, what do we know about David as a child, for example?
Not much.
Yeah, there's not much happening.
Well, I guess we can infer some things, right? We can look at the fact that he was a shepherd boy that was, didn't have any
Shepherd boy, yes.
particular renown, like he wasn't from a royal family or anything like that. So we can assume he grew up in an obscure sheep herding family.
Okay.
Maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He was the youngest, I believe.
How many brothers did he have?
I think like 11 or 12.
Yeah,
He
quite a
wasn't
few.
12 or
Yeah.
something.
So you can imagine being the youngest of a lot of siblings would probably have an impact on the way he was parented.
Yeah. So
Like his father would have
or not
been
parented.
considerably older, for example.
I can think of two things. One, he was the afterthought, and as a parent, I know that I love both of my girls, but Abby, if you're listening or watching this, we love you and we have care for you, but we were trained a lot more because of Beck. So when Becky came, we were like very overly cautious because we didn't have a clue what we were doing. Second came, it was a bit easier.
Yeah.
Maybe. And so imagine having so many kids and you're like, oh, David, like...
Yeah. Just go and do what you do.
Yeah. You'll survive. You're not going to die. It's
That's
okay.
right. Like how they say in Australia, like she'll be right.
She'll be right, mate.
Yeah. And that's what probably happened. Or he was somebody who was really long for beloved and overprotected.
Right, like Joseph.
Yeah, like Joseph. I don't know if he was overprotected as such, because I mean, if he's like a little kid going to the mountains, facing bears,
Fighting bears.
lions, and whatever, he's like, he keeps on coming back. He must be
Yeah.
okay. So that's something about his childhood, and yet we know very little, and yet we know a lot, because we know that the biggest story that we know of David, at least from childhood, is that he was fighting this big, massive monster, right? And I don't know what you think about this idea, but can you imagine being, I don't know, I think scholars battle between, was he 12, was he 13, 14? I don't know how old he was. I don't even remember his Bible.
He was certainly small because he didn't fit into Saul's armor, right?
Correct. So Saul was the Bible describes him as a very tall, handsome guy, muscular perhaps. So he's battling. So can you imagine, let's imagine that he's, I don't know, let's imagine he's 16 for the sake of, I have the feeling that he might have been younger, but let's imagine he's 16.
Be generous,
Yeah. Can you imagine going and killing somebody?
Yeah, wow.
I mean,
in the full graphic way as well, right? Sometimes we think of it as just a stone from a distance, but that didn't finish it.
No. He went and got the sword and hit him. Have you ever driven on the road and hit something?
Yeah.
I don't know how you feel. I felt terrible.
Yeah.
Hitting a little tiny kangaroo, hitting a duck.
Well, it's worse when you don't quite kill it and you have to go and finish it off.
Yeah.
That's a hard thing to do.
I don't have the heart to go back,
Oh,
and maybe that
okay.
makes me feel bad. I think like, no, it was $100
I had an
an
experience
hour.
once where I was trying to do that with, I won't tell you the details because it was graphic, but I couldn't finish it. So it took several goes at finishing this suffering animal off. And every time I tried, it just felt worse and worse.
Yeah. Well, so that's him, right? From very young age.
Yeah.
And then I know there's, some of us, if we might, depending on the listeners where you're listening from, I mean, we might go hunting, shooting, even fishing. I mean, depending on the degree of what we consider life to be valuable. Like we fish and we're killing a fish. I'm like, that should be okay. But here we have a human being killing a human being.
Yeah.
And we have to remember one thing. We were not designed to die. Neither were we designed to take somebody else's life from the beginning. And so this guy is doing that, and it didn't finish there. What do we know after that? What comes to mind after that sequence of that story? I guess.
Was the song that they were singing about it was like Saul has killed his hundreds, but David has killed his thousands, or something like that?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Thousands, 10,000.
Thousands and 10,000s, yeah.
But
So we
he goes into being military man, right?
He
It's like
became
kills many
like an SAS,
Yeah.
Green Beret, Navy SEAL, and he goes and he's killing a lot of people.
Yeah.
And what we know when we are facing such scenes is that trauma comes to life.
Yeah.
So it's not hard to see how he could have been a little bit messed up.
Can I just back up just a tad? I just wanted to say about the childhood experience that you were describing and the fact that he was out doing those things in the field and working hard and slaying lions and bears, etc. Do you think that would have built into David's young life like a degree of resilience that maybe most children don't experience?
Yeah, I think, definitely. I think it was a preparation for what he was to come, theologically speaking.
Yeah.
But if you just take it as the human face life value,
and do you think
prepare him for a lot of things?
Do you think that, from a psychological perspective, do you think that would have at all prepared him for Goliath and what was to come? That level of resilience, or like would that maybe have lessened the scar?
No, I think it will have prepared him, because after you take a life, it's easy to take another.
Right.
Now, there is a big jump, though.
Please tell me you're not speaking from experience.
No. Yes, I am, actually, from experiencing people. I work in jails before. It makes it a little bit easier. We desensitize, and that's what that's the human condition. When we desensitize to things that we do that once we didn't do. But there is still a big jump, though.
Right. There's still a resilient effect.
Yeah.
A residual effect is what I was trying to say.
Yes, absolutely. Now, the other thing is, I mean, we cannot avoid the religious, spiritual aspect, that he obviously did this because he believed that it was offensive to his God. So, and I think this, when we're preparing for this, I remember I was mentioning to you guys, remember sometimes there is duty and then there is choice. And so, when I think about the life of David and his mental health, perhaps some of the things that he got into were by duty, while some of us may get into trouble because of choice. We could argue he still had the choice not to go and kill anybody. Except for when he was protecting himself with the bears and the lions in his ship. But otherwise, he didn't have to go and do this. I mean, he was a little guy.
He was only there to deliver food for his brothers and so forth.
For sure.
He wasn't there to fight Goliath.
For sure.
Yeah.
And so I when I think of that, and the reason why I'm mentioning that is because there might be people here watching this, listening to this, and I think of, there's a lot of things that we are facing because we have to sometimes. Because we could argue, but you choose to, but sometimes we don't have options. There is duties that we have to carry on. So, but anyhow, moving forward with this, he's having this traumatic experience that didn't end there, because remember that song that you guys mentioned, is it Ben Townsend to thousands or whatever?
Saul
he killed thousands and
Saul killed his thousands and David killed his tens of thousands.
Right. Yeah. So now we had this guy, and we should make an episode about Saul, by the way, because I think they should know the guy on the other side of the story. But now they had this guy who is jealous, who's trying to persecute David. And that also reflects in his writings that you were mentioning, that poetry, that anxiety. You could argue that the Psalms that David wrote out his journal of some kind.
Yeah.
His self-therapy in some ways, to be honest.
And maybe some of them a hymn book for when he went and played for Saul.
Yeah, it could be. Absolutely. And so now he's persecuted. And so it is not hard to see that he is going through a lot of affliction. And so when I think of him, and we read the Psalms, I think of somebody who is traumatized, who is anxious, who might have fallen into a bit of despair. I don't know if depression will be the idea here, but definitely anxiety and trauma. So so symptoms that you see with such conditions are poor sleep, a bit of a sense of hyper alertness, hyper vigilance. When you think like, hey, you know, my enemies are following me, they're chasing me, and that was true for him.
Yeah.
That's what I was about to say. Isn't that exactly what was going on there?
So it wasn't paranoia.
Yeah.
So it wasn't psychosis. It's a different condition. When like, I know people are following me, and they're not.
Yeah.
They are following this guy.
Yeah.
He's actually in legitimate danger.
Correct.
And so the hypervigilance is justified, but it still has an effect on his life, right? And his mental
Correct.
health.
Yeah, 100%. And so he's not at peace. He's not restful all the time. And that's when he's writing some of this stuff that we have. I mean, I just wanted to read like some of the things, like as part of his sketches in his life. There's this thing that says, "When I kept silence, my bones waxed all through my roaring all day long."
Yeah.
Like, one thing is, when I kept silence, that's an interesting thing. You know, he was keeping this to himself. It's like an internal turmoil all day long, and that's what mental illness can be. Mental health conditions or mental illnesses don't. There are real medical things that are there all the time. It's not like, oh, one day I feel like this and one day I feel like that. It's like a constant thing. We might have glimpses of hope, but overall, there is like the overarching experience is based on this. For him, anxiety, worry, hypervigilance, if you want to call it. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
It does.
Can I ask, and
Yeah.
feel free to defer this to later in the conversation if you feel it fits better, but how important do you think that his friendship with Jonathan was, considering that trauma and that experience that he was going through?
Good question. I think it will be very important when we think of social connectedness.
Yeah.
It helps us to find support, to find reassurance, to find a confidence, perhaps, to be able to share the struggles. You know, that idea of a burden share is a burden half. So I'm assuming, because they were so close, that he will talk, hey, you know, your dad, like, he's a piece of work, like, can you tell him to please stop? And things like that. So I think it will be definitely something. And I'm glad you brought that up, because that's a practical thing that can help somebody who is going through a struggle, for sure. Social connectedness. And
obviously Jonathan was his closest friend, but on top of that, as we go like later in his ministry, talks about David's mighty men, right? The guys that were the closest to him that he went into battle with.
They were, like you were saying before, Dan, the SAS of the time.
They
were insane.
And he definitely, they were definitely special forces in there. David's life was definitely a very classic, good example of somebody who is suffering from trauma, from anxiety. And I think this is the beautiful thing. He still was able to go through despite the struggles. And I think for me that brings us hope. Because as you read the writings, his journaling, he still finds some hope and reassurance. Now, I would like us to think maybe of practical things that this guy did to help himself. When you think about his life, what do you think as such?
Sorry, what were the things that helped him?
In your opinion.
Yeah. Well, I think the release that we were talking about in the Psalms was probably a big one. I think having a way to express what you're feeling in a similar way to that social connectedness that you were talking about, how that somewhat halves the burden. I think having an expression is also a release that maybe not halves in this case, but certainly lessens the burden. It sort of lets it out a little bit rather than it sort of being contained within you.
100%. Yeah.
And I think one of the other things that we see, you get glimpses of it in the Psalms especially, but where he talks about his relationship with God and how he relies on God so strongly. I think probably one of the only ways that outlet was actually helpful was that he was giving those burdens over to God, consciously trying to ask God to bear them on his behalf. And so that consciousness of there being, that God is there, and not only is he there, but he cares about me, sort of thing. That understanding of God would have been, a really key aspect of that, which is similar, but it's directed towards God rather than someone else.
So understanding of God and where he fits in the picture.
Do you think that some of his drive to conquer and succeed once he gets out of the survival part of his story. You know, once he becomes king and he starts expanding the empire and doing those sort of things. Do you think in some way that was him trying to find some sort of stability and success or meaning in the suffering that he'd been through?
As in,
like trying to feel better, I guess, if he has experienced all the trauma and the anxiety that we were talking about, do you think he was pushing the kingdom further to get success, to
sort of finding purpose in mission?
Try to find purpose
to appease himself?
Yeah.
Maybe. I mean, he knew he had a duty. We already know that some of his anxieties were justified. I mean, we mentioned that.
Mm-hmm.
And once that was appeased, it would have been easier for him to try and move on. But it took him a while. We don't know how long or how many years. The problem is that it wasn't, as we mentioned, there was the bears, the lions, the Goliath.
Mm-hmm.
Then you have Saul. And
later
then,
Absalom.
Yeah, yes, we have mentioned that, and that's true. And
Mm.
then you have he kills somebody else with a justification.
Yeah.
He
I want to get back to
people-
that bit.
Yeah.
He takes people. He takes women. His own pleasure. There's a lot of guilt embedded in this
Yes.
in this sin. Guilt and shame.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And guilt and shame usually are symptoms of depression, but they can also come with a bit of trauma. But there is a lot of, and then losing the child, we have him at the temple crying for his child. But that's an interesting thing, and I don't know if, I won't divert to that, but it's interesting to think that he's there grieving the loss of this child, and then once somebody comes, hey, he died, he's like, okay, he moved on.
Yeah.
How can that happen?
Yeah,
That quickly,
But well, okay, everybody. So that was a break in transmission there because we had some technical difficulties, but we are back in the conversation. So, and we've racked our brains, and I think I remember the last question that I asked. So, so just to pick up where we left off, we're talking about David, and when he did seemingly recover so quickly from the
loss of his
experience
child.
of the loss of his child, do you think that was because he was already processing the grief before the child actually died?
It is a very high possibility. So what we know is that science has told us that when we lose people differently, we grieve differently. So for example, somebody who loses somebody suddenly, like a suicide, a car accident, plane crash or something, they might take longer to go through the process of grief and loss. Whilst if you're prepared, for example, somebody in an oncology ward waiting for the death, and you already know, hey, we're giving them this amount of time, they can process from beforehand. It still doesn't make it easier. It's still hard. And you also have individual factors, of course. We cannot avoid that, the individual personalities and experiences, as we're talking about David. So yeah, definitely. I think definitely that will be a plausible explanation as to why. Also, the other idea is that we had to remember that he was a man of God. And even though he messed up and it looked like he was dissonant to his beliefs many times, God told him, you're gonna, this is a result of sin, and this is gonna happen. That was his judgment, and he accepted it. Accepting things do help in the process of grief. Matter of fact, in the stages of grief, there is this process of acceptance. So that could have an influencing factor as well.
Yeah. And I think one of the other things would make sense is, do you think he could have been desensitized based on the fact that he'd already seen and caused a lot of death prior to this time?
Yeah, definitely. He will have been desensitized to death and dying. Remember, we still are not designed for this. So what happens here is that he has been doing a lot of this stuff. Remember that mental health is an interesting thing. It can be cumulative. So at some point in time, nevertheless, it will catch up to him, and we see it in the Psalms as well. But it's a possibility for sure.
So I got a question for you, Dan, around the time period where David had that, let's say, lapse in judgment with Bathsheba, and then the resulting killing of Uriah, etc.
Yeah.
So just wondering how you see that as to whether that's linked to the initial trauma that he experienced in his young life.
I think for that, it does have influencing factor on the guilt and the shame, but that might not necessarily be linked to trauma. It can, but it doesn't have to. And I think this is the point when we might need to define what trauma is. So trauma is anything that it's caused us distress psychologically to the point that it's hard to bear. So we have to process it. It becomes more harder to bear. So when we think about a trauma, we think about in the sense of a mental health, psychiatrically, psychologically, in the textbook sense. Trauma only takes place when we are being threatened, either ourselves or somebody who we love. So if for example, if my life is at risk and I've been traumatized, like his life was, you know, David Saul chasing him, trying to kill him, trying to do something to him, that will be traumatic for him. At the same time, if people who he loved have been at risk of dying or died, that is also something that can cause post-traumatic stress disorder as per the manual, if you want to call it, of mental health disorder. So yeah. So I don't know if that will be traumatizing as such. It will be more as a sense of guilt, shame, and despair by doing something that it wasn't right. It is a complex thing though, because at the same time, it wasn't. When you could argue that he didn't know what he was doing, how at the beginning. So he sees this woman, he lusts for her, he interacts with her. Sexually, immorally, because he wasn't his wife, and then he finds out what's going on, and then he sends this guy to be killed. We could argue that maybe he was a bit psychopathic. That's a bit different though. Yeah.
And so do you think that he was at that point, or do you think that it was motivated, like it's a slippery slope?
Yeah, 100%. And I think that's where, when you read some of the Psalms of David, you know, of having a broken heart, a broken spirit is what it's needed instead of sacrifice. I think that tells us a bit about his journey, because he wasn't humble enough to accept the consequences. I mean, imagine that, you know, shaming the king. What are you doing? This child is. So it was a hard, easy fix, if you want to call it.
Yeah.
But you need to have. I mean, how many of you would actually do that? I would like to think none of us four here will feel like,
I would certainly
hey,
hope
let's
not.
go and kill somebody to cover up.
Yeah.
This guy, and that tells you a lot about his mental health.
Yeah.
I mean, he was a man of war. I would like to think that even, I mean, any of our armed forces, any person who was in Iraq comes back, I would like to think they will not do that either. Unless you are really, really far beyond in terms of the mental disturbances you have. This guy was, savage in some ways, even though he was restored.
I think though, to relate to the story, if I was trained in the art of war like David was, and I was deep in depression like David was, then I could foresee doing what David did, right? And I think that's what you're saying. The reason why we don't respond exactly the way David did is because we are different people. But if we were in the same sort of mental state, we would still look for a way to cover our sins like David did. It just might be a different mechanism. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, his judgment was cloudy. And we could argue he was cloudy from the beginning. Because again, he is seeking to satisfy his sexual pleasure. So he's been on a journey.
I mean, let's be honest. He was on the roof, knowing full well that was going to be a possibility. Am I right?
I mean,
I don't think we need to make him out to be innocent.
So he was seeking opportunities, perhaps. And
it'd be like analogous, to bring it into modern times. It'd be analogous to going, on that part of the internet where, I might just bump into something that I don't, know I shouldn't be bumping into.
I don't want to add to the Bible because I don't want to be cursed, but we can have we could have sanctified imaginations, and I will think it's not hard to maybe extrapolate that this might not happen the first time.
I think that's very fair.
You don't go and hey, I like the woman, bring it over. It's like he will have some interaction before, because you desensitize it slowly. That's what sin is, right?
And usually David would have been out at war. at that time,
Yeah,
right?
technically, he should have been with the army
with
like
Uriah
he was every other
and
time.
co.
Correct.
Right?
Correct.
So it's quite possible that, like you say, his mental journey didn't begin on the roof that day.
No.
He might not have gone to war because he was in a bad place, and he might have gone to the roof because he was in a bad place.
Yeah.
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 Sort of premeditated in a sense.
Yeah. So yeah, it definitely contributed to his mental decay or deterioration. That probably would be the best way to portray it. His mental deterioration. I'm not sure it will be adding to the trauma, perhaps the trauma of killing another life. But in this case, I mean, there is a difference, right? Between
Sure.
going out to adjust the people of God as given by God versus killing an innocent person who was part of your special forces.
Yes.
Who guarded you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's messed up.
Probably even a friend of
Yeah,
David's.
yeah.
Yeah.
When you read the list of David's mighty men of valor, Uriah the
Uriah.
Hittite is in that
Yeah.
list.
That's
So
what I
they
call it,
would
the
have-
special forces.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's right. They would have fought back to back.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, that would be like, you know, me stealing your wife. You know, assuming like next time when you get one.
Maybe you should be pointing
maybe
at him.
You said it, so I was replying to you. Then I realized this is going to break
Yeah.
down this analogy
Your-
really quickly.
your analogy's
That would be like me
broken.
stealing your wife and then having you killed. You know, we've
Yeah.
been doing ministry
It
together
is
for
messed
years.
up.
You know,
It
it's
is
just
definitely
unthinkable.
messed up.
So, yeah.
And do you think, Dan, that this was a turning point for David?
Well, it definitely is. I think when we see the storyline, we don't see him after we. Well, let's think about what happened. Guy comes, prophet of God tells him, "Hey, you're messed up." He initially didn't know that, and that's something that happens in mental illnesses, mental health, emotional stability, and sin as well. What David needed at that time is become insightful. There is that key word that we use a lot in mental state examinations. Does the person has insight, awareness of self? And he didn't. But interestingly enough, when you read the Psalm that it refers to that, he didn't have the awareness when was it Nathan?
Yeah,
Yeah,
Nathan
Talked to him, the prophet.
Yeah.
But the Psalm says how he was being afflicted.
Right.
So he's suffering and suffering and suffering, but instead of, going back and confess, not to Nathan, because we don't confess to men, to God and say, hey, I messed up, I'm so sorry, my heart is afflicted, I'm never doing it again. Maybe he never did it again after that, who knows? He didn't. Somebody had to come to tell him. Which tells us a little bit of something, I'm glad you brought that up, because obviously I'm biased about this. I don't believe in confession to men, but there is a point, talk about friendships you mentioned, do you think Jonathan would have helped him? And I think so. I don't know if Jonathan was there at that time. I think maybe he was already gone, fallen in battle. But maybe having that avenue to say, hey, you know what I did? This is what happened.
Yeah.
And he's like, okay, that's not good.
Yeah.
What have you done?
Yeah.
Are you right with God?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think friends like that will be very good and
Yeah.
beneficial.
Yeah. You spoke of awareness then. So like through Nathan's sort of parable, if you like, he became aware.
Yeah.
But I really like in Psalm 51 where he describes, how that made him feel. And when he went to God,
Correct.
that awareness transformed into acknowledgement. So as soon as he became aware of it, he was willing to own it. And I think that's got to be crucial in moving forward.
That seems to be a pattern for David too, doesn't it? He seems to take ownership of whatever the situation is very, very quickly.
Yeah.
I think that's the reason why God says he was a man after his own heart. It's a case of, yes, he did some evil things, but the moment it came to his awareness, he actually went to God for forgiveness. He tried to turn his life around, although he was constantly falling into trouble. But at least he acknowledged, and his first instinct was to go to God, to lay his burdens upon God, rather than sit there and try and deal with them himself. Because as we go through his trauma, do you think that without God he would have made it as far into his life as he did?
Definitely not.
No.
Definitely not. I know there are a lot of people out there who might have gone to trauma, anxieties, and they still have been able to recover at that mental health, psychiatric level, if you want to call it. But there's a spiritual aspect that will always remain. So for David, in David's case, God was a very super important thing in his life. So there will have been no way to recover without him. No, absolutely.
So how crucial would you say, like from your interactions with patients, how crucial would you say acknowledging your circumstances are when you're going through anxiety and trauma and depression?
Definitely one of the most important things. So one of the first things that we tend to do with patients is bring that awareness, and there's something that we call psychoeducation. So we talk about, hey, this is what's happening with you based on what we heard. This is what's happening with the brain, with the mind, with whatever, with your storyline, your narrative, and that will bring awareness.
Is the objective of that to normalize their situation?
Normalizing, 100%. Yeah, you're normalizing where you're at based on your experience.
Right.
If somebody said with David, hey, we know you're making poor choices, and your poor choices are influenced definitely by some of the experiences you have, by choice or by duty given by God. You will have to make it easy, like, not to feel self-pity or justify his sin, but rather, his affliction.
Right. Yeah.
So, I will say that plays a role.
I think that's really important, speaking, at least in this context, we're talking about in a spiritual sense, because when a lot of people, and you've probably experienced this a lot more than any of us have, but there's a lot of skepticism of, mental health in Christian circles. I think a lot of people that do have that skepticism, who view, well, if I am diagnosed with anxiety or depression or whatever, it somehow reflects on my level of Christianity. For people that think that, if they're not willing to accept that they could be suffering from one of these conditions, then it's very difficult for them to get treated, I would imagine, because they don't acknowledge the fact that it's even real, because, I prayed this morning, so of course I'm not depressed.
100%. Yes. I mean, for David, there's a combination of factors. There is those traumatic experiences we already talked about.
Yeah.
But there is also his choices that were poor, and you mix them together, and it was a recipe for his mental health disaster. But I can think of, and we'll sidetrack, so I won't sidetrack, but I can think of other examples in the Bible. Maybe we could do another episode on that. Where there is a clear indication that you can actually be okay with God and still suffer. Right.
Oh,
in this
I'm
case,
looking
David
forward to
was.
that one.
In this case, David was guilty in some ways.
And so therefore suffered.
And then he suffered, but he also suffered because Saul is persecuting him.
Right.
In that case, he didn't do anything wrong either.
There was both external and internal
100%.
challenges. And so in the psalm, there's sort of like, as I mentioned, I see this as a turning point for David. And, he says, I acknowledge my transgressions. But as I keep reading down, it says, purge me, wash me, hide your face from my sins. And then he says that sort of crucial verse 10, create in me a clean heart and renew a steadfast spirit within me. From your perspective, like a professional perspective, how would you describe this idea of having creating in us a clean heart and renewing our mind?
Well, there is something that comes when we think of afflictions based on guilt and shame, which is what David really is talking about here, in my opinion. And he's coming to a sense of internal peace.
Right.
And I think that's where Christianity has the advantage of seeing that, hey, if God exists, and if He is there to overlook everything happening in the world, and if He acquits me or makes me free from the guilt, then I should be okay. Now, that can also happen for some people without necessarily having God, which is an interesting concept, because in Christianity there is a conflict there. How can you be not feeling guilty if God hasn't forgiven you?
Right.
But we can actually go through the process of not having the mental affliction by a process, for example, of forgiveness.
Right. I was going to say, Paul said that one of the things that he sort of attributed to his peace was that he had peace with God and with man. And I guess what you're describing is that even if we don't necessarily have peace with God, having peace with man enables us to feel that sense of... Correct.
Yeah. And both are good. Both are, I believe, important and necessary.
Right. Yeah.
Like, how many times you say, like, I'm okay with God.
Yeah.
I have forgiveness, but I never went and say, I'm sorry because I actually slapped you across the face. Because I intentionally did it because I was so upset.
Yeah.
Or whatever,
Right.
So, there is that element of peace. But
and Jesus would argue with that anyway, and he would say, well, do you really have peace with God if you haven't made up with your brother?
100%.
Yeah.
And we could argue the opposite as well. I mean, and this is where the origin of the question was, you can have peace with men, but then there's that spiritual peace that the world is trying to search for.
Right.
And that's where, I guess that's when the boundary sometimes between the profession and theology.
Right.
But, it is an important part of the work.
So
to be able to come to that point.
So what goes on in our psyche when we experience forgiveness, like this idea of this renewal of the mind?
Oh man, freedom from the affliction of knowing that you are there. What's the name of the guy? There's this. You guys have heard of this program, Forgive to Live?
Yeah.
Okay, Forgive to Live, great program. If anybody's listening to this, whoever is listening to this, I know that a lot of people listen to this, watching this, go and check out this book, Forgive to Live. I forgot the name of the author, but I suspect there are not that many with that title. But he brings this analogy that I like, which is not forgiving. So not the opposite to forgiving. Not forgiving is like drinking somebody else's poison cup.
Right.
Right. So you're stuck in there. The other person left it there for you, or left it behind, and not even intentionally sometimes. And we're like, oh well, I like it, so I'm keep on drinking and killing myself and living this affliction, mentally turmoil, thinking that this person is a piece of work. On the other side, another analogy that I could think of is not forgiving is like driving your car and always looking at the rear vision mirror. So what happens when you drive your car and always, without a doubt, looking at the rear vision mirror? I mean, you're going to look at an accident. You can crash and burn and die, or be injured, or whatever. It's not going to be safe. So it's not good. It's not good. So it's very important for us to be able to go through that process. So even when we talk about this is probably a different topic altogether, but we are branching out to this idea of grief, loss, as well as letting go of things, feeling peace. And there is usually two psychological options that come. Either we continue with anger, resentment, or we go to that pathway of forgiveness. And some people choose the one that is not the most beneficial, and they live their lives for a long time like that.
Yeah. Is it possible to experience this renewing of the mind, even if... so yourself, even if you have not had that experience of knowing that the other person is sorry for what they have done. So let's say you've experienced trauma at the hand of somebody else. They're not sorry for it. Can you experience forgiveness in yourself, even though they're not sorry?
Absolutely, because forgiveness doesn't imply somebody's going to come to say, sorry, right? So forgiven by default. This works in English only, by the way, guys. I have an accent. I speak Spanish. I speak whatever. But it doesn't work in Spanish. I also speak a little bit of Croatian. It doesn't work in Croatian, but in English it works. Forgiveness, forgive. You are forgiving your right to actually retaliate. Right. By default, if you slap me, I have the right, an eye for an eye. I slap you back. But I'm forgiving away that right to slap you back. And I forgive you without you having to say hello. Or I'm sorry. Or hey, let's reconcile. Right. So it can happen with that. It definitely can happen with that.
I love that fact, right? That there is still room for healing, even if you've been abused by somebody else and they're not sorry. That you can still experience the peace of forgiveness yourself by, as you say, giving up the right to feel, hurt by that experience anymore.
Yeah, absolutely.
So
it's a beautiful thing.
Just to come back to David, if David came into your office,
here we go.
That would be cool.
Yeah, it would be. But if he came in, sat down, and he said, "Look, this has been my life," and you went through the process with him, at least based on what we know from Scripture, what would be your treatment for him? What would you recommend to David?
Okay, the first thing that I would recommend to him is something you're already doing. I would like him to journal his experience. Journaling is something that it's a crucial aspect to be able to deliver emotions. You see, when I see a patient today, and then I see a patient whenever that happens in 2 weeks, 3 weeks, a month, ideally for such a case, it's significant. I will see them, sometimes you need to see them twice a week. It doesn't happen in real life because it's quite costly in time consumption in terms of business. But between session to session, you don't have an influence over this person's inside mind, ability to be able to process the narrative, the experiences. So journaling is something that it's proven scientifically. There's heaps and heaps and heaps of data that shows that it's beneficial. And that's the reason why when we at the beginnings talked about the Psalms, and I mentioned, he was doing his own therapy unbeknown to him by writing these songs, these psalms, these narratives of his experiences, and crying unto God, of course, in the process. But journaling is one of the things that I will ask him to do. It implies monitoring how you are. And when you look at his journaling, you see that he's, we talk about self-awareness and insight. You see that he had insight. There is something that happens when we sit and reflect on our own life and experiences. And he's writing things, and he's like, but this is what's going on. I feel afflicted. I don't think he does talk about his iniquities and things like that. Very rarely. It's usually, sometimes it's more about the people who are following him. But every so often you see glimpses of, I know that I messed it up. So yeah, that will be one thing.
Dan,
Yes.
As you're answering this question,
Yes.
I have a friend who's been going through some tough times, and
Okay.
she's been seeing a psychologist.
Okay.
And we've been having a chat in the middle of the week between her appointments with the psychologist, as just like a checkpoint with a friend, right? And I'm not qualified to give her psychological help. I just act as someone to bounce thoughts, bounce ideas, talk to her about what she's been applying from her visits with the psychologist. Would you recommend something like that as a potential treatment as well for somebody like David, to have a close person that they can bounce, as a checkpoint in their life?
Yes. Yeah. So I think I must define that there is a difference between friendship and therapy. So therapy is actually a scientific treatment to be able to.
Right.
It's a method. There's a method. There's a methodology that it has been proven. This was a random chat. Chats do work. I mean, when you look at David, you could argue, well, he didn't have a therapist, and he was okay. Maybe we could argue, maybe he could have avoided a lot of the stuff. He had therapy beforehand. I don't know. But there is a difference, I think. So you mentioned if I could recommend the idea of friendship. Yeah, absolutely. Is that what you intended to ask?
Yeah, I guess intentional friendship though, as in like
You're not just having a cuppa together and having a laugh and going home. You're actually talking about what's important in their life and
checking in. I guess that's sort of what you were saying about the journaling is kind of what triggered the thought. It's that monitoring the awareness you have of your own well-being.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it will be definitely helpful. A lot of people do actually. It happens more in ladies. I think there is a bit of a cliche that ladies keep a diary of some sort. A lot of men do. When you look at historically, back in the 1800s, 1700s, people look at journey of their lives, and there's nothing wrong with that. So it's not there's no gender definitions in there. But I think that there wouldn't be a bad thing to keep a journal. I will be surprised, as a matter of fact. I don't know what different therapies work differently, but I will be surprised if at some point in time your friend is not going to go through a process where a practitioner says, hey, it would be a good idea maybe to start writing something.
Already has.
All right, there you go. So it is definitely part of the process. If we look at David's resolution and treatment that he had, if you want to call it, we can learn from is he utilized that journaling. We already talked about it. He also utilized prayer. A lot of his journaling was prayers. So, and we have science after science that shows that the religious spiritual science, Duke University, one of the institutions, Ivy League in the United States, has this whole department talking about spirituality and mental health.
Okay.
And they have a lot of research that shows that when you pray, you can actually improve not only mental health, but your brain structures change.
Right.
For the better.
Why?
Well, that's a mystery of God. But I think you mentioned something.
Like, is it disciplined thought, like regular disciplined thought that helps with that? I mean, obviously God is going to be the central feature there, but I'm just curious what the mechanism is.
Well, when we pray, we use specific areas of the brain. There's that connection between the frontal lobe and the striatal connection that goes to the emotional part of the brain, and those are the areas usually that lead up when we pray. So the more you use it, the more growth there will be in the brain. So there is the cortex layer gets thickened. Also with depression, we have evidence that it thins out for people who are going through depression and significant anxieties. Now, you mentioned something about David and the perception. What was it about? Something about the perception that we have of God. I don't remember exactly how it was, but maybe I'm making. I don't remember what
I said either.
but I just wanted to bring this to the attention of the prayer, because to what we pray is important. So the evidence has shown that, and this is more into the suicide research, which is one of the things that I kind of like embedded myself into for years. But when we the God that we pray to will make a difference for good or for wrong. So if I pray to a God that is not kind, compassionate, and caring, like for example, an evolutionary God who puts us here to our own, and left us to our own devices, the prayer is not beneficial.
Right.
A chastising, punishing, vindictive God, and this is the
It'd be
this is the
traumatic
thing.
in itself, wouldn't it?
Well, and we in Christianity live a lot like that sometimes. We're living with this ideology of who God is, and we justify by the sense of righteousness and justice and whatever. But sometimes we cross the line when we see him, this wicked individual who is here to get us, unless we do whatever he wants us to. There is boundaries, of course. But when we pray to such a God, it increases the anxiety.
Yeah.
And it's research, there is evidence that shows where people say, hey, like, this is the God, this is how I perceive God, and this is how prayer has helped me. It goes the opposite. So in my doctoral dissertation, when I talk about suicide, I actually, this is hard because sometimes you have your belief systems, but you have to go by science. And so science tells me, and I reported that actually people who believe in such God will be better by not believing in God. It's hard to tell.
Wow, I was going to say, so what you're saying is, for mental health reasons, let me just get this straight. For mental health reasons, you are better off being an atheist than a Christian who believes in a harsh and dictatorial God.
I don't know if an atheist, we didn't go,
Well, isn't that what not believing in God is?
It could be an agnostic, in search of something. But maybe disconnecting from God. I don't know. That's another different idea. But so it can be. And I should stream and downstream this. We're not talking about suicide because David, I cannot see him suicidal at all in his life. He was a survivor. But he. In the facts that I'm sharing with you have to do with suicide, and that's again maybe we're sidetracking here, but that's a different topic.
We can talk about that more in another episode. But
but that does happen for people because they lose hope, and when they search to God, like, oh well, this is the God that is gonna, it's vindictive, punishing, and caring. So there is no hope. We're in the last resource, and so that's really where the issue is. So to David's treatment, you said journaling, monitoring, prayer. Is there anything else that would stand out, or? I don't know if David focused on this as such. Actually, as I was gonna say something has crossed my mind, so I'll say this before I forget it, which is he had a problem with sleeping. So one of the things that anxiety and trauma causes is very poor sleep. Sleep pattern, your circadian rhythm goes messed up. And one of the first things that I like to see in my patients, there is a couple of things, the journaling is one practical thing, but I want to make sure that the sleeping is better. I lost track of my thought. Sleeping is better, and their the habitual routine during the day as well, which includes the use of substances. So we don't know much about David's substances. So I was thinking here of coffee, but it's more than just that, caffeinated substances. But it's.
Do you mean things that will directly affect the sleep?
Yeah, 100%. Well, actually, caffeinated substances don't only affect sleep; it actually increases anxiety, which is funny. Well, not funny because people feel energized, but it increases the side effect is anxiety, especially when drunk in significant amounts.
Okay.
So it will have an effect on individuals, not only sleep but anxiety. So what I will say is look after sleep, and we know that because I think it's Psalm 4:8. He talks about, hey, God, help me sleep. Give me something so that I can be at peace. And it goes back to that. Overthinking, ruminating. But the one thought that I was originally thinking is, Jesus Christ, God himself, said this thing. He said, don't worry about tomorrow. And anxiety is about that. Anxiety is about, what's going to happen tomorrow. When you think about David being persecuted, he's thinking about, somebody's going to come. That's tomorrow. It's not even happening right now. He's in the cave and these guys are like 1,000 kilometers away. He's like, oh, they're going to come. Or maybe they were closer. Who knows? But God says, don't worry about tomorrow. Enough trouble has today. So one of the things that we talked a lot about in terms of treatment, I love it because it's very biblical as well, is that we need to start thinking about today. Today, the right here and the right now. We can use the past to learn. We can use the future to hope. But right now is the only thing that we need to consider,
Is there anything you would control over?
100%. Well, half of it, but yeah, 100%. Control is one of the things that, as a sidetracked, but it's relevant. We could argue that most, if not all, mental illnesses are linked to control. The inability to be able to have control over something that is afflicting us. And that's the reason why it's disturbing.
I love how throughout this conversation, as we've been sort of chasing David's story, we're seeing just how complex human mental health is. Like, we've gone on all these sidetracks because they're relevant to David's experience, because David wasn't just traumatized and anxious, right? There were all of these sort of other sort of side issues going on in his life, because humans are complicated, right? It's just the way we are. That's the way our emotions, our mental health goes. And so I think it's important to realize that, like, if you're going through something, you might not be able to put one diagnosis on your situation or whatever. There might be many sort of areas in your life that you could be relating to these characters in the scriptures and sort of seeing through their story how God comforted them or worked them through that situation that might be helpful to you.
100%. 100%. As you were mentioning that, this thought came to my mind, David, about the other David, but about setting a specific, this is probably the last thing that I'll mention, because there is a lot of things that can be done depending on the person's situation, but one thing that we know that could potentially be helpful when we are anxious, worried, is setting, it goes back to that control, that idea of loss of control, setting up a time during the day when we can actually sit down to actually do that. And that could be part of that journaling.
And when you say do that,
worry.
Okay.
Right. So
that we don't have to do it.
I'm due for my worrying.
That's actually, there is apps. There is an app for those of you who have iPhones, Androids, or whatever you have. I believe it's in both. It's called Worry Time. And it's designed, I think, was it Beyond Blue? No, Reach Out Australia, whatever, it's designed specifically to sit down and say, hey, there's all of a list of worries that I need to focus on, and I'm going to leave it there. I'm going to put it in this box, and that is trying to regain a little bit more of that control.
Right. So that when you're laying in bed at night, you don't have to worry because you've already done it.
Well,
you're not allowed to.
This is not worry time.
Worry time, right?
Yeah. And sometimes it's not as easy, but it helps. There's proof that it helps. But sometimes it's not as easy. So if you're lying in bed at time and you're worrying, one of the things is you can think, I already put it in my list, or tomorrow at 12 o'clock is when I am actually going to worry. Today I'm going to sleep. But sometimes it's not enough. So sometimes you have to wake up and say, okay, I need to make sure that I write down all of these things that are bothering me.
It's funny. I can actually really relate to that, like organically. Like, I mean, I don't use the app or anything, but for me, if there's something that's bothering me, I am definitely a note taker. If I don't write it down, it will destroy my peace of mind. And so Sarah sometimes she's like, "What are you doing? It's late." And I'm like, "I need to get all of this out of my head, because if it's out of my head, then it's not bothering me." And so like I've got like big A2 notebooks with like all the stuff, not necessarily worries, but
A2.
Yeah.
A2 are like massive.
Yeah.
I literally have like an A2.
Yeah. There's one of them over there on the desk underneath the camera bag. So, but I mind map, and like all of the stuff that's in my head, like I put into that. So these are like all the things that I need to worry about ministry. This is wing is all the stuff that I worry about work. This is all the stuff I worry about family, and not necessarily worries, but all the stuff that is just taking up mental space. And once I get all of that out, then it's like, well, I have a plan there. I don't have to think about it because I'm not going to forget anything. And so I just close it and I'm done.
It's emotional energy that we spend otherwise.
Yes.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
You know you have significant worries when you need A2, right, Dan?
I was just impressed. Like, I know A3 is double D. So
we'll have a look afterwards. Hey, it sounds like we're trying to wrap up. But I just wanted to ask you one more question about David.
Sure.
So in the Bible, he is referred to as a man after God's own heart.
Yeah, right.
Tell me how.
I have no idea. You're very theological.
Come on, man. You're the expert.
Ben mentioned that. What do you think?
I was going to say...
Yeah.
I was
go.
just going to say, maybe what you're getting at, David, just to augment the question, is to ask, how is it possible like that he is a man after God's own heart, considering all of the brokenness that we've discussed?
I mean, I'm not going to own that question. That's your question.
All right, what I think
Yeah, what do you
from my perspective is that I think something that we already alluded to during this episode is part of David's well-being and treatment was to seek God.
Yeah.
And try to reflect God, and that's something that we call cognitive congruency. So he had this belief system, and he was searching God and help him, knowing that, I mean, just let's make it practical. When you do something nice in your Christianity, not because it's gonna save you, not because it's gonna give you brownie points, or maybe you could think that it would, but it feels well. It sits well. So I'm extrapolating here a lot. I'm just thinking that part of David seeking God constantly and seeking to be more like him despite of his mess ups, help him in his journey to feel better.
Right.
To accept things such as, hey, I want to build a temple for you, God. And God is like, no, it's not going to be you. Look at your hands. They're full of blood. Yeah. So it's like, okay.
I'll go and do a collection instead.
Yeah. Compare that to somebody, David, who is like, I like that woman. I'm going to have it because I'm the king.
Yeah.
He could have said, God, well, that's your doing. I want to build a thing.
Yeah.
Which is similar to what Saul did.
Right.
That's the opposite. And again, I reckon we should do an episode on that because it's a bit of an opposite situation.
Yeah.
There.
Yeah, we will.
So,
Okay.
And Mephibosheth is a really good example of what you're saying as well.
Okay.
You know, David was like reaching out of himself there. Yeah.
What do you think it intends to say, in your opinion?
Oh,
Theologically speaking, personally speaking, in terms of David's being as God's own heart.
Yeah. Look, I agree with you. I think it was just that attitude of searching, right? You know, even through all of his mess and his struggle, he, like, if you read the Psalms, you just get this idea that he just wanted to know God, right? Through all of that mess, it didn't matter whether he was, you know, going off and committing adultery, killing people, whatever.
It was full commitment.
Underneath all of that, in his heart, he wanted to know God and he wanted to be with God and he wanted to serve God in the best way and he could, right? And he stuffed up along the way, right? But yeah, I agree. It's that sincerity of commitment that I see. But I don't know.
He was teachable.
I don't know either.
I love that because that is available to everybody.
Right. Yeah.
So to my patients, to you, to me, to every single person.
Yeah. Possibly my favorite Psalm, 27. One thing have I desired, and that will I seek after, to know the beauty of the Lord. Right.
Yeah.
That was what David wanted. So I really like that.
Oh, thanks for sharing that. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Well, with that, I think this has been a good start to this series. So there will be more. Don't worry. Dan will be back, and we look forward to catching you guys next week. But if you have enjoyed it, please share it with a friend. And if you're watching us on YouTube, you can like, comment, and subscribe. We would love to hear more from you guys. If you have any other specific characters that you would like to hear us cover in the future, let us know. We'd love to hear about that too. So you guys have a great week, and we'll catch you next time.